Guys, remember Big Dreams, Bad Jeans, available at barbellapparel.com. It is restocked, and we are doing our $100 giveaway. $300 gift card. Just go to basestrength.com, download the app, take the questionnaire. Doesn't cost you a thing, and you are in the running. July 4th, we are announcing that. So let's get into it. Squat depth is one of the most overblown subjects in today's fitness culture, and I am going to tell you point by point exactly why. Now, it wasn't always this way. It used to serve a very good, very important purpose. The shaming that went on about people putting a barbell on their back and only doing a shallow knee bend. But times have changed, and to understand this change, we got to go way back in time to Y2K era. So pull up a chair, kids. Granddad's got a yarn to spin. It's story time. Now, when I started lifting around the year 2000, before Facebook and YouTube, the only influence I had for how to do anything was what I found in bodybuilding magazines, whatever bullshit my high school football coaches happened to tell me, or whatever mishmash of information I happened to get from the old timers at 24-Hour Fitness. So considering the lack of role models and that this was an era where all shorts went past your kneecaps, there really wasn't much incentive to squat, and there was certainly no reason for anybody to enforce it among everybody else. It was fucking uncomfortable. Why would anybody want to do it? Don't give me shit, I won't give you shit. Now, even being focused on strength, I couldn't find anything about powerlifting. It just wasn't a thing back then. The entire sport was multiply. There was no raw division, so it was dominated by these bloated 380-pound post-diabetics. They'd get stuffed into their gear and waddle out to the bar like sweaty, shrink-wrapped sea lions. I mean, these guys were in such bad shape that meat promoters should have got sponsored by dialysis companies. Now, the name of the game for multiply powerlifting was just tightness and compression. You stood super wide so you could use your hamstrings and groin as brakes to stop you flat when the muscles were pulled to their maximum limit. You valsalva'd, so your immensely engorged omentum that surrounded all of your organs would push against the belt and the 3 layers of Kevlar, creating so much tension that you could balance a Volkswagen on their back and it still wouldn't be enough to push them into a legitimately deep squat. Safe to say, squat depth was one of the first casualties of multiply lifting and wasn't really on anybody's mind. So then over that decade, a few interesting things happened. Social media took off where everybody could share their lifting videos, and we now had an open platform where people across the world could criticize you for your shitty lifts. The internet is definitely a toxic place, but it is not without its upsides. And around the same time, CrossFit, that's right, CrossFit, forced a huge popularization of the barbell that hadn't really existed in the last few decades. It sent people to Olympic lifting, sent people to powerlifting and strongman. And a lot of the resurgence of raw powerlifting owes itself a debt to CrossFit that got a lot of people doing squats, deadlifts, and presses for the first time. So in this new ecosystem of early internet shitposting paired with housewives and accountants doing ass-to-grass high-bar Olympic squats, it was no surprise that the meme of never skipping leg day would be one of the first things to take over fitness culture. Now, of course, this created a problem. For every bit of benefit we got from more people squatting, we had to face the inevitability of exponentially more garbage squats. So the internet did what it does, and it forced everybody into tribes that wildly overcorrected for this problem. On one end, you'd have purists who would say the only reason you would ever do a squat is if you take it below parallel. That's not only where all of the sacred gains are, but it's also a direct test of your manhood and your value to every other person in the room. You'd have people that would go farther than that. They'd hyperfixate on things like foot position, knee valgus, degree of hip shift. Squats didn't just have to be deep, they had to be perfect, like a brush stroke from Michelangelo. Weight on the bar doesn't matter. And then you had people on the other end that said, fuck that. I'll take your poor, you're hungry, you're shallow squatters. Some strength and conditioning coaches insisted that the best thing to do was load the fuck out of a barbell and do shaky quarter squats with no stability just to get as much force production in that range as you possibly could. You have the Joel Seedmans of the day, the most noble of innovative strength and conditioning personalities, who insist that 90 degrees is actually the only squat that you should ever perform for any reason, and that going below that is injurious. Now, of course, these rivalries exist to this day. The battle between it has to be perfect and nah, it'll be fine. You have people touting effective ranges of motion and mechanical tension, and other people putting all of their eggs in the stretch-mediated hypertrophy basket. And none of this even addresses what your specific goal is. Are you trying to become the best squatter in the world? Are you trying to play a sport? Are you just trying to get bigger thighs that you can oil up to crush watermelons on your OnlyFans page? Or are you just an average Joe like 99% of lifters who wants to get a little bigger, a little stronger, and ground your mental health with some hard work a few times a week. Let's start with hypertrophy. Does deeper mean more growth, and by how much? On the extremes, we can generally look at limited ranges of motion, partials, top end work, isometric, and say that doesn't grow muscle very well. You'll get very, very, very strong in that specific range of motion, but you're not going to have a lot of mass to show for it. It seems like the muscles have to go through some range of motion. It seems like you want to disadvantage the muscle in those ranges of motion, and it seems like you have to build up some amount of fatigue in those ranges of motion. Now, people will say that the research has been shown that it's generally better. The fact is, the literature fucking sucks. I'm going to say this over and over. It's small groups of people. They can't account for the most important things in how you respond, and that is individual variables. We are light years away from that. If I ask an evidence-based guy and a bro coach with a lot of experience working with different people, are 5s better or are 10s better? The difference is the evidence-based guy is actually going to try to answer it in a serious and decisive fashion using nothing but the shitty literature that he has to go off of. It'll be the bro guy, the coach with a practical experience, the person who uses outcome to dictate his rules, that is going to recognize what a stupid fucking question it is because there's no information. You have to ask, what lift is being used? 10s on squats isn't the same as curls. What's the rest of the program like? Doing GVT 3 times a week is different than doing 3 sets of failure on a 2-day split. What's the person's training history like? Are they adapted to this stress because they've been doing it for a long time? You've been doing a decade of 5s diligently. Do you think 5s are going to have the same stimulus as a 6-week block of 10s? What about a high rep bodybuilder in the opposite way? What's their experience like? Is it reason to believe an 800-pound squatter is going to struggle more at one rep range than another? Are there practical considerations? What's their build? How awkward is the movement? What's the weak link that's going to fail as they get close to failure? These are all the questions that matter infinitely. So you can start to see how asking these simple questions based on the literature is fucking meaningless. Technique is no different. Now, it might be that these patterns hold up. It might be that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is shown to be better for everybody in all situations. No matter who you are, if you want to get bigger, get as deep as you possibly can. And if you can't get deep, you better start stretching so you can get deeper. Even if it turns out to be true, the important thing is we don't have enough reason right now to know that it's true. Trying to use evidence to determine that this is better is like trying to use a screen door as a fucking life raft. It only works if you seal the fuck out of it with your real life experience. So then the question is, what's keeping you afloat, the experience or the screen door? As much as range of motion has always been a principle for growth, the real question here is how much do you need? Like, at what point are you really selling yourself short? I'm not here to advocate that you can get big ass quads doing quarter squats. That's probably not the case. But if your hips are getting somewhere around parallel, a couple inches above maybe, how much are your hips, your glutes, your hamstrings, and your quads going to grow? And if you continue progressing that movement, will you potentially get just as big? We can look at Johnny Jackson and Branch Warren, who trained like a couple of maniacs, but they also had stellar physiques and big ass fucking legs doing really shallow ass squats. We could look at Tom Platz on the other end, who did really deep squats and was known for insane leg workouts. However, he applied those same principles to his upper body and it grew like shit. Does this mean that genetics and steroid use, specifically how you genetically respond to steroid use, is the most important thing for getting big legs? Probably. But how do we fit that into this mold, and what does it mean for everybody else? The answer is it doesn't really give us anything conclusive. We just know that there are massive exceptions to this rule. And with something like a squat, that's all you're going to get is exceptions because it's a crude tool. It's not surgical by any stretch. Some people are built to grow very well from squatting. I'm one of them. I have short legs. Pushing my knees forward has always been super easy, and I could spam the shit out of squats when I was younger. If you're a bit leggier, finding a way to get depth is a little more difficult, and also it tends to be awkward. Leggier guys, especially if you have tight ankles, have to ride their hips back a little bit. That's a longer moment arm to the hip. That requires more work there, a lot more glute, low back, hamstring development, more so than quads. A lot of those guys have a hard time making it work for their quad development. So you have somebody like Ronnie Coleman, who, let's not forget, was an awkward squatter. He was a leggy ass lifter. Watch him in his early days walk out to the deadlift bar. The dude is built like a human crane. The fact that he had the mobility to squat with the depth that he could was pretty incredible. So the question is, why insist on squat depth for something like quad growth, given the fact that quad growth is probably going to require a lot more than just squatting, and the effectiveness of squatting is going to depend on the individual anyways. Bottom line is, we've seen a lot of people get really fucking big legs a lot of different ways. And if any one of you had to guess Who's likely to grow more? Somebody that uses a variety of different depths and techniques over their training career or within a block, or somebody who only does the stretch-mediated hypertrophy thing and is forever limited by the force they can produce at that specific position. I don't think any one of you would bet your mortgage on one or the other. So moving on to strength. This is really the important thing. Who gives a shit about getting big? Do you want to get strong? Well, you gotta squat ass to grass to get the best strength gains. Well, first of all, strength in this context is another stupid statement. Doesn't tell us anything, it's too broad. Strength development happens at particular ranges of motion. This is hugely important to understand. If you do top end work, if all you do are yoke picks, you can get up to 1,500 pound yoke picks. Doesn't say anything about your ability to squat halfway down to parallel, below parallel. You can get extraordinarily strong working partial ranges of motion, but the carryover to other spots is going to be limited. Similarly, if you do full range stuff, you're going to get very strong full range. You're probably going to get a bit stronger top end, but it's not going to scale as much as it potentially could. Julius Maddox is a great example. Strongest person in the world off his chest, which means he's the strongest person in the world with a raw bench, but he can't hold Jimmy Kolb's lunch sack when it comes to doing pin presses or isometrics at the top. Load up 1,500 pounds and see if Maddox can hold it at arm's length. Probably not. However, strip off Kolb's supportive gear, his ridiculous band bench shirt, and have him cut the weight in half and take it all the way down to his chest, you're gonna see him suffocate before that thing moves up to arm's length. So if you're trying to use a squat, a crude tool to develop strength, you have to know what strength you're trying to develop, and your ability to develop strength always depends on what the weakest point of the movement is. So if you are always going below parallel, where that is mechanically the weakest position, that will determine how much force you can produce. It's also important to note that at other ranges of motion, you will always be moving the bar in the context of momentum. So you won't be developing strain there, at least nearly as often, not until you're getting fatigued to where the bar starts to slow down. So think for a second, you have two athletes that need to be very explosive on the field. One of them is only doing squats below parallel. They get really strong. They're pretty strong below parallel, pretty strong top end. But you have another one that's doing box squats 4 inches above parallel. Now, anybody would look at that and make fun of them and say, what are you doing? That's not a real squat. Take the weight down, lighten it up, have some respect for yourself. However, the potential to condition yourself to generate force from that high box squat position is really, really, really fucking high, and you won't optimize it unless you're training from that position. Learning how to break a shit ton of weight from a dead stop and force your hips through in a short, quick, compact range of motion that mimics what you're going to do on the field has infinitely more to give to your specific athletic development than just arbitrarily doing a below parallel squat. Again, a squat is a broad tool. Non-specific tools give non-specific results. If you're looking for specific output, you have to make the lift specific. There's a little bit of nuance here though, because this is best done on the back end of some physical training. Just like with money, you need to have a little money to make money. Just like with this type of work, you need to have a physical foundation before you can do that shit. If you have your 8th graders try to do this, you're gonna have a really fucking bad time. So start out with full athletic squats that generally build some muscle, generally build some strength. But by the time you're towards the end of high school, getting into college, this type of stuff can be devastating for athletic performance if it's done intentionally. I can tell you from experience, a rock bottom squat is not going to inform how an athlete's stone loading or tire flipping is going to go nearly as much as something like their ability to do a high box squat or some type of partial top end range of motion. It doesn't mean that full range squatting isn't useful. Growth still happens, still super vital. It just means it's not as specific. There is a use case for other more specific modalities. Case in point, here's Zydrunas Savickas doing squats with a lot of fucking weight, cutting depth. Notice that he's moving like a human forklift. He's not bouncing the piss out of the bottom. These are two very different physical qualities. When you have an Olympic lifter bounce a shit out of a squat with their butt cheeks touching the ground, we're inclined to say that's way more impressive. It is a completely different physical ability we're watching, and we don't really have a scale for what the upper limit of it is. We just see, oh, deeper, that must be harder, not realizing that the way that they change direction is using kinetic energy. You're really strong isometrically, you're also really strong with the muscles pulled all the way fucking tight. So at the very bottom of a lift, the muscles freeze, they turn into rubber bands, hands, and you can redirect that kinetic energy in a bounce type motion and get momentum on the bar going upwards, where then you learn to follow through. It's not that different than doing like a push press or a cheating row, building the momentum and then following through. It's a skill that you learn. People that are really fucking good at it can game the shit out of it. If you have any of these people try to mimic that squat with a slow descent and a controlled change of direction from a parallel or above parallel position, it's not going to be that impressive, and it doesn't matter because it doesn't really need to be for what they do. But for general strength, for being a human fucking winch, for being toe mater, there is a lot to be said for having the wide stance, kind of slow, grindy, winchy type of movement where the hips come back under control and just reverse direction like a fucking forklift. That's something that Zydrunas is capable of doing. That's a valuable skill in people that generally need a lot of strength above parallel. And it's not to say that one of those should be all of your training. It's just to say that there are different use cases. Do you think Zydrunas would have been sufficiently better if he didn't squat this way? If he focused more on bottom end strength work that he never would have really needed for his sport? Probably not. But then again, he's a Zydrunas, so maybe it wouldn't even fucking matter. So to summarize this entire mess, does squatting deeper make you bigger? Yeah, probably in certain situations, but there's probably also practical considerations that make that not the case if you have an awkward build, or if you're, I don't know, one of the most muscular and physically developed people on the fucking planet, and maybe you need to think outside of the box to trick your body into holding a little bit more weight. And how much more muscle do you get, and how does that pan out over an entire training career? The answer to that is we don't fucking know. As long as you get some stimulus and progress that over time, that equals long-term muscle growth. Your job is to stack that up as much as possible, and shooting yourself in the foot to try to arbitrarily use a broad tool like squatting to get a little deeper because you think that's where all of your gains hinge on is completely misguided and looking at this the wrong way. A sufficient amount of depth, getting somewhere around parallel with a lot of effort over time is going to grow your legs just fine. And if it doesn't, then squatting probably isn't a good option for you anyways. For strength, you get stronger where you train. So make sure you're training in a range where you need to be as strong as possible. In powerlifting, that has to be below parallel. It's different for other sports. So always keep in mind if your technique is serving as a general developmental tool, which is very important and should probably be a little deeper, or if it's supposed to specifically transfer over to performance, in which case that general quality goes out the fucking window. My general rule for most people is to get right around parallel because it checks a lot of boxes. It makes you safe. It generally builds a lot of muscle, generally is going to prevent weak areas. It's still going to increase your top end strength. And it's also going to make sure that you know how to get deep if you decide to compete. Squatting a little bit high is just fine for people that just generally need a lot of lower body strength and maybe specifically need more top end strength for the sport that they compete in. And yeah, if you're going complete half or quarter squat, that should only be reserved for the most specific training, which usually just happens at the end of your training. We can all agree that generally some range of motion is going to be where the most overall growth happens, but there is absolutely a use case scenario for athletes doing really fucking heavy limited range squatting. As far as going super deep, this is actually where I find the least compelling case to exist. Super deep is really great for Olympic lifters who need to do that as per their sport. It might be okay for some bodybuilders at some point during their training, but there's probably value in loading up the squat and changing direction at a different point, some point in your career, so you get a different pattern of motor unit recruitment. It seems to be the trend in lifting that some amount of variability is needed, more so than any one specific variable being so important that you should just always do that and never do anything else. For developing strength, I don't know, besides Olympic lifters, who needs to be strong in that specific position, and it's going to severely limit how strong you could get in other more productive ranges of motion. So given the overlap between getting pretty good hypertrophic growth right around parallel and what that does for actual substantive strength and power development, right around parallel seems to be pretty damn good. Where you go in between that, going a little lower, a little higher, probably going to depend on comfort, your build, physical abilities, and most importantly, what seems to be getting you results. There is nothing that is going to make up for you taking notes. So that is my take on squat depth. There's a lot of different things that fly, and they're probably all appropriate in different situations. Let me know what you think about this. Do you agree? Do you think I'm full of shit? Leave your hate in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.